So I'm going to go ahead and share a slide deck that I've prepared, and we'll try and zip through this in about half an hour or so and leave time for questions. So let me get things set up here. Just one moment. I've got too many screens. Let's see. All right. So today, as Dr. Lee noted, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experience using data visualization and my journey through from being an undergrad like all of you to now in my position as a lead scientist with Conservation Science Partners. Kind of going to weave a little bit of storytelling along with some plots that I hope that won't bore you to death, which is always the goal. But I wanted to talk a little bit about my career trajectory and how I've gotten to where I've gotten. And so we often think about, I'm of course going to start with a plot, data free, but nevertheless want to tell a story of how I thought that my career would want to proceed. I'd want to, as time progresses forward, I wanted to see my career trajectory go up and to the right, improving that gets me into a place where I want to be. In reality, you'll note that life is really messy, and sometimes data looks really crazy, and sometimes it even does things that you don't expect, like go backward. And so I just want to note that I'm going to start here and talk a little bit about how this career trajectory has not followed a smooth path, and that there are often many different ways that one can arrive at a place where they want to be, and that you sometimes have to embrace the pivots when they present themselves. So briefly today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey from being a young elephant-loving child, a little bit about my time at Stanford, and how I tried to pursue a dream of elephant research science, and then how I had to take a little bit of a pivot and a detour, but nevertheless found a way that I discovered that I actually do love data. I love visualizing it. I love trying to put it together to tell stories both scientifically and within a conservation context. I'll talk a little bit about one of the big pivots that happened in my career during what was supposed to be a PhD at Brown. And afterwards, my work with Utopia Scientific and now today at Conservation Science Partners. So as I mentioned, I came into college dreaming that I wanted to be an elephant research scientist. And I had always been obsessed with these animals since I was very young. And I was able to pursue some of that work, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next couple of slides. But as a young scientist, I knew I was interested in data, but coming into college, I didn't have a lot of experience. At this point, it was 2009. There weren't as many resources out there about learning coding or learning data analysis at the high school level. And so I went into college not having a really robust quantitative skill set other than that you're taught, and really had to learn how to be a researcher as an undergrad. And this is where I met Dr. Lee. I actually took an introductory seminar with Dr. Lee as a sophomore in college, and it was great. It's so funny that our worlds have collided again. But while I was at Stanford, I was in what's called the Earth Systems program, which taught me to think about environmental problems in multifaceted ways and from multiple perspectives, and thinking about how to take those problems apart and identify the parts of the problem that you could push on to push towards solutions. And while that's not necessarily what I would say is like data visualization in its most rigorous definition, but nevertheless, it is a conceptual way of thinking that does inform the way that I approach most of my data analyses. So I just wanted to mention that briefly as an interdisciplinary and multi-perspective approach to environmental problem solving that I think will also be beneficial to take forward in your competition, thinking about this data set from multiple perspectives that are on your team, but also thinking about the different audiences that might be receptive to the stories that you tell. And while at Stanford, I mentioned I wanted to pursue a career in research. And so I did actually get to have a chance to join one of my mentors, Caitlin O'Connell Rodwell, at her field site in Namibia in Southern Africa. And there I learned how to study male elephant social behavior, which is incredibly niche. And surprisingly, there are not many careers out there with that in the title. But nevertheless, it did instill in me a love of research and a love of data collection and trying to put down a bunch of information. I didn't necessarily get all the mentorship I needed when it came to analyzing that data. And in college, I actually in my first ecology course, I dropped out of that ecology course because I was expected to just learn how to code without any experience in R. I had no rooted experience or tutorials provided. And so I was actually put off by statistics, put off by data analysis, and was convinced that I wasn't smart enough to do it because I wasn't able to pick it up. And it really did put a little bit of a damper on my vision of what my future as a researcher might be. Nevertheless, I tried to like store that. I ended up going back to that ecology course as a senior, took it again, got a little bit better instruction that time around, and was able to like instill in myself a little bit more confidence in my ability to analyze and present data in a more rigorous and I think traditional sense of producing figures for scientific manuscripts and what have you. Not something as fun as producing an infographic like you all will be producing in part of your competition. But after undergrad, I really thought that, the path that was for me was I really wanted to be an elephant conservation scientist. And in order to do that, I needed to go and get a PhD. Well, it took me a little bit of time to try and find an interim position. I thought I really wanted to work in wildlife science, trying to find a job in that sphere that could also pay the bills. And unfortunately, was not able to find much at the time that really fit what I needed in terms of cost of living, but also that actually I felt confident enough to pursue with the skills that I have in my toolbox at the end of undergrad. And so I actually had to take a little bit of a detour after coming back from a field season of work, realizing that I A, needed health insurance, but B, needed to branch out and teach myself a little bit more about some skills that could set me up well for pursuing a graduate degree. And part of that detour was working at the Carnegie Institute for Science at its Department of Global Ecology on campus at Stanford University. I worked with a woman named Catherine Mock, who did a lot of work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN body that is kind of like the global authority on climate science. And what her role and my role as a research assistant with her was to essentially pursue a project where we were analyzing the documents that this body produces in these big plenary events where they are editing these reports that summarize climate science by line by line. And those processes are fraught because they're essentially a bunch of scientists also talking to a bunch of government representatives who have their own agendas. So these documents change a lot, but looking at how they change can inform how science policy dynamics are actually affecting these like global environmental policy. And in this role, I got a lot of experience teaching myself how to work with really complicated data. We were trying to read through documents and devise ways to extract information about what changed through these plenary processes, and it produced this mountain of information. And we had to work together to figure out how are we going to present that information. And I'll say I wasn't necessarily the most elegant data visualization specialist at that time, but nevertheless, I found an opportunity to teach myself a lot of coding, for example, of working in Illustrator to finesse figures and make them look pretty, and learned a lot in this position. And I'll show just a couple of examples of the figures that I produced at this point about 10 years ago that were presented in this particular publication where we were looking at how many paragraphs expanded, how many were deleted, and looking at those across different sets of reports. And we also pursued an interesting analysis called bibliometrics, which I discovered by reading through literature that essentially analyzed the text of these documents relative to things like reference texts of public reports that were used for other disciplines. So I'm not going to go through these figures in detail, but nevertheless, it opened my eyes to the many different ways that you can use your creativity, your innovative thinking to present information to tell the story you want. Ultimately, what we use these figures to tell, the story that we use these figures to tell was that this process is messy, and sometimes these reports get more clear, and sometimes they get less clear, and that can sometimes be by design. So as I wrapped up my time working with Dr. Mock at Carnegie, I realized that I did indeed want to do a PhD. And so I decided that I was going to apply, ended up applying like once, didn't get in that time and had to do another year of work, build my skills up. But then I did end up starting a PhD. And as I'll just like give away the ghost here, that I ultimately did not finish my PhD. And I'll talk a little bit about what happened in that perspective and how data visualization and my experience with data actually helped me find a way out of this. So when I went into my PhD, I wanted to do three things. I wanted to do a ton of field work and live my field biology dreams and develop my own elephant study. I wanted to be a National Geographic Young Explorer. I had very lofty goals. And I wanted to develop a set of science-based skills that would allow me to secure what I wanted was a non-academic wildlife research job and or enough ecology street cred with a PhD to get a seat at the conservation table, to really try and to get into the room where people were making decisions about the protection of species, the protection of environments. And often in this field, it seemed from the outside that you really did need a PhD to get into those rooms. I also wanted to be a happy and successful person that grows through significant challenges, but ultimately is able to perform at a high level. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. And as a grad student, you are expected to avail yourself of the resources that are around you because there's not always going to be coursework or somebody to teach you. You really have to get good at teaching yourself things. And luckily, by that time, there were a huge number of resources online that were making coding, data analysis, data visualization easier to access. And I really tried to dive into those things to pursue my interests. Ultimately, I never got a chance to study elephants in particular during the first 3 years of my PhD. Um, I did end up studying what was called DNA metabarcoding, which is where you analyze DNA that comes out of undigested food and animal dung. So not super glamorous, but nevertheless produces huge amounts of information. And so I was able to learn how to do things like phylogenetic analyses and displaying, phylogenetic trees in my data figures that you'll see like in the lower left-hand corner. But I also, through this work, was really interested in analyzing space and how animals use space and doing geographic analyses or geo-specific analyses, seeing the world from above and trying to understand how all of these different pieces are working on the landscape scale. And how that manifested was I actually ended up designing an animal-born camera unit that was attached to a GPS collar that I affixed to these domestic camels at a location in Kenya. And I really leaned into trying to visualize these data by availing myself of a variety of R packages that let me visualize animal movement, realizing that's really where some of my passion lied and really let me dive into that whole world of animal movement analysis and thinking about the ways that we can see animals using space and how that drives our hypotheses about why they might be going here rather than there. What food resources are they after? Are they after water? Are they avoiding predators? So it really helped marry my interests in ecology with my interests in understanding geospatial analytics. But unfortunately, as my third year of my PhD rolled around, I was running into some problems. So I had to land at this PhD position in a brand new lab. I was really like the first pancake of one of my advisors in my advisor's lab. And so there wasn't really a handbook for how you're supposed to do this, and not a huge amount of support from other grad students. I took a lot of time to explore many, many different projects and topics, trying to merge them with my passions while also operating within the constraints that were put on me funding wise, but also I didn't have necessarily the connections I needed to pursue the work I wanted through that particular university. I ended up starting to feel really intellectually isolated. I didn't have a lot of conservation-minded classmates. They were really more focused on theoretical ecology, as well as some other topics that just didn't jive necessarily with what I was thinking about or really passionate about. That led to this really dark time of increasing self-doubt and mental health challenges. I really struggled with anxiety and imposter syndrome. I was convinced that I wasn't smart enough to finish something. I wasn't smart enough to analyze the data in the ways that I thought I could or that I was supposed to. And ultimately, this came at a time when my qualifying exams were looming, and I was going to have to produce a thesis proposal on something that I really was not passionate about and wasn't convinced I could finish a PhD on. That led to increasing panic and a little bit of pressure. And that essentially led me to a decision and intellectual paralysis where I didn't know what to do and I was really stuck. And what I'll show you next is how a kind of data visualization helped get me out of that. And I have to give credit to a best friend who helped me navigate that process. So at that period of time, it was about January of 2020, I really had to reckon with what was coming down the pike and what a decision that I really needed to make. Was I going to stick around and try and finish my PhD, or was I going to move on and try to do something else? And ultimately, I had to sit down with my best friend, and these are notes from that winter time where I was like, I don't know what to do. Can you help me figure this out? And this is not necessarily data visualization in the classical sense either, but we mapped out all the different potential pathways or futures that could exist or options that I wanted to pursue. And then we plotted them in space. We developed a visualization to help me make decisions where we plotted these different futures and different pathways on a quadrant where things that, where I was going to be happy or unhappy. And on the x-axis, I was going to be more non-academic, but still sciencey versus more academic and sciencey. And as you'll see in that right-hand figure, it's a little crazy. But nevertheless, it helped me figure out, oh, if I want to get from here to here, about how long is that going to take me? If I want to get from, here, I want to be a very happy person, and I also want to be in a non-academic position, here's the career that I might want to pursue as a next step. And so this really was an opportunity for me to think about data, not only in the sense of like numbers and figures, but also in feeling and thinking about the story that you were telling about yourself. Not everybody's mind works like this. And obviously my best friend helped me. I didn't necessarily call myself predisposed to thinking in this way, but I nevertheless like to share this figure with folks because I do think it's a way that we can kind of distill information down for ourselves. We are bombarded with information both internally and externally all the time. And when you try and boil things down to a set of X and Y axes where you can plot things against one another, you actually can see things emerge and you can actually watch paths kind of reveal themselves to you and go back to this time and again. And so I decided ultimately to exit my PhD program with a master's thesis. I wrote and defended my thesis from my kitchen table during COVID. So that was like not the most fun experience, but nevertheless taught me a lot about how to be resilient in the face of challenges. And so I had to, after I graduated in May in 2020, as the pandemic was setting in across the country, I really had to scramble and make a plan. And ultimately, I just had to jump. I I didn't have a huge amount of plan. I moved back in with my parents at 29 years old and was a little bit distraught that my career seemed to be in shambles. But nevertheless, I had that figure in the back of my mind of like, what is it that I'm going to try and pursue? And ultimately, I really wanted to go back to my passions. I wanted to use all the skills that I'd taught myself during those first 3 years of grad school in geospatial analysis, in data analysis in general, in statistics, and try and get back in touch with my elephant research goals. And I ultimately was able to make it work a little bit for a couple of months through the support of my former mentor, Caitlin O'Connell. Worked for about 6 months for her organization, Utopia Scientific, analyzing a variety of data sets related to elephants that some I had helped collect and some that were sitting on a shelf waiting for somebody to tackle. I'll provide just a couple of examples. I'm not going to explain all of these necessarily in detail, but it really did push me to be more of a research scientist and producing figures that go again into research publications. So that's why they're not necessarily always the most beautiful or infographic-y. You'll see like model-based results coming out of the figures on the left, for example, analyzing how baby elephants interact with each other and their mothers over time. But also it drove me to be innovative in how I think about all of these different types of data. I was really interested in animal social interactions. That drove me to learn how to do social network analyses and plotting how these animals are interacting with each other in the field. That's what you see in the middle figure there, a network of male elephant societies that we study, as well as some things that are a little bit more rote, thinking about how you can just present information about how elephants grow, for example. And we actually discovered a way that you can use things like an image of their face, and it actually aligns well with the traditional measurements of how we age elephants, like the height of their shoulder, and presenting that information that you can see in this right hand figure that like actually all of these things have the same kind of trend or the same kind of pattern in them. Helped us discover that actually there are easier ways to age elephants than trying to like measure their shoulder in the field, which is really difficult to do. So after about 6 months, unfortunately, the grant funding ran out to support me in this project, and I really had to try and sit down and figure out, okay, like how am I going to pursue my career in conservation from here. This wasn't necessarily conservation specific work. This was more animal behavior and traditional like theoretical science, but I wanted to work on something really applied. I wanted to put my passion for the environment and protecting it into practice. And I'll bore you all the details. It took me a long time to find a job. Unfortunately, at this point in time, it was a very difficult hiring market through COVID. I'm sure many of you experienced similar things. But nevertheless, I was able to essentially pester my way into a job at my current firm, Conservation Science Partners. And what we do is we're a kind of like a conservation consulting firm, and we provide a lot of quantitative research and planning services for conservation-oriented projects, both here and domestically, but also internationally in Canada and in other parts of the world. And this organization really spoke to me because it married all of that quantitative data loving kind of science with my desire to affect change and to preserve the places that I cared so deeply about. Just to give you a little bit more detail about the organization, we try and think about science as the tool that helps us, capture the beauty of nature, present it to the people and our partners that are working hand in hand to protect those places, to affect positive change for our society and our environment. We do that through a variety of different modalities. The thing that I'm most deeply involved in is with our advanced geospatial analytics and Earth observation analyses. I use a huge amount of information almost on a daily basis that is looking at and making maps from a variety of data to try and tell stories about where is there important habitat, how do we know about it, how many species of concern are in place X versus Y, and why we shouldn't build a solar facility there or an oil and gas well there. That's the kind of work that I do on almost a daily basis. We also do things like multi-scale conservation planning and design from the local scale, say your local reserve, to thinking about West-wide analyses. How do we develop a network of reserves or protected areas that improve connectivity, for example, for a variety of species that support ecosystem level function? And we also do both ecosystem level and population modeling, tracking how populations change over time and what's affecting them. Is it things like, we think about tortoise a lot, the Mojave Desert tortoise, which maybe some of you are familiar with in Southern California. This is a highly sensitive and endangered species. Their population has been plummeting. We don't know why always, and so we're trying to tease apart all the different strings of data that might be able to tell us a little bit more about why those species are declining, for example. Is it ravens? Is it people in recreation vehicles? Is it roads, et cetera? So those are the kind of questions that we at Conservation Science Partners really address in aggregate. I am currently housed in what we call our Changing Landscapes Lab. And so what we do is we apply innovative and cutting edge science to address these interacting trajectories of land use change, things like human development and climate change, thinking about how it's shuffling where we're developing, but where animals and plants are shifting their ranges in response to things like increasing heat or changes in precipitation or extreme events like fire. With the idea that the science that we're producing, being able to help people mitigate and adapt to climate change, help their environment and the species that occupy those areas do the same. I'm really involved in a lot of ecological habitat connectivity modeling, so thinking about how animals are moving and how we integrate that information into infrastructure planning, for example. So thinking about how we can use really complex connectivity modeling to inform where we put crossing structures so that animals can get across roads, both today and in the future. And we're also thinking about how we can use many different streams of data to promote human-wildlife coexistence. As humans and wildlife, our ranges essentially continue to overlap as humans expand into more wild places. I provided a couple of visualizations here of the kind that I've produced in the last several years, everything from maps to summary model outputs. And I'm even working on web applications and thinking about how to make data interactive and how that helps people make decisions and explore opportunities for strategic advocacy. So we work with some of our partners who do a lot of work who are trying to avoid development of intact landscapes, for example, from oil and gas drilling. Presenting this information in an interactive capacity lets you figure out, how does, if I change X thing, how does Y change? And it lets our partners think about scenarios, for example, and how that can improve the outcome, the conservation outcomes by choosing the most optimal solution, for example. And I just want to note that we're awash about data of our natural world, and you'll be working with a huge data set that is part of that, but we're really in the golden age of environmental data, environmental ecological data. We have things like satellites spinning around the Earth on a daily or monthly basis, providing huge amounts of information that's in the form of imagery, telling us how the land surface is changing. We have increasingly sophisticated climate models that tell us both how climate was in the past, but also how climate is expected to change into the future, giving us information about how we need to be planning our cities, how we need to be planning our ecological reserves so that animals can adapt to increasingly extreme changes that are going to make it really difficult for some of them to survive. But we're also in the golden age of data that's collecting things like camera trap images across many parts of the globe where it's really hard to get to and collect data in the kinds of volumes that we need to make really good inference based on statistics. Data like autonomous recording units or camera traps provides a huge amount of boost in that realm, where we don't necessarily have the people power. And we're increasingly able to like access all of this data through a variety of platforms and portals. eBird, if you've ever heard of eBird, is an online portal where you can download huge amounts of information that looks at the status and trends of birds across their ranges. You can look at, birds in your area, for example, and seeing how their populations have changed over time. And you can use things like iNaturalist that gives us an idea of where citizens, where all of us can participate in the monitoring of the ecology and evolution of our planet. But with all of that data, it's often difficult for us to make sense of all of it and for distilling all of it down into stories that can make an impact and get into the hands of people who are making decisions, both at the policy level, but also in your neighbors, like thinking about how that affects their behavior to drive those positive conservation outcomes. We really do need to try and figure out which pieces of all of that or which relationships are important. That requires a lot of practice. But nevertheless, data visualization is a key tool in conservation. It really is the crux. Making maps and displaying information is at the heart of conservation, because that's often the ways that you're going to drive people to change their minds or to understand something that they didn't understand before. And that often comes in the forms of maps, charts, infographics like you will all be making, web apps. And so I just want to encourage you all to think carefully about how these tools are going to be used to tell the stories that you want to tell about national parks, for example. I'll just provide a couple of examples of the kinds of data visualizations I've worked on in the last couple of months. In the upper left-hand corner is a map of a connectivity model that I've helped produce in the state of Nevada to help inform their Nevada Department of Transportation think about sites where they might install conservation or crossing structures for animals, like I mentioned earlier. Devising an innovative way to like summarize that information in the vicinity of different highway segments to help them make decisions about where these kinds of interventions will be best suited today and tomorrow and in the future. The big figure you see in the middle is the Colorado River Basin and shows a little bit of how you can represent two types of information in one map. It's called a bivariate color palette or bivariate visualization, where you can think about, figuring out where to highlight the places that are of really high value or are at the most risk, for example, by, using color and also using space at the same time. Obviously, traditional model-based outputs from statistical models, they're not always the most exciting, but nevertheless, when you're communicating it to other scientists, figures like the upper right-hand corner, that in this case, we're describing our predictions around what predicted puma-human conflict in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. Those are something that I do on a daily basis that nevertheless I continually have to learn how to do. I don't have all of these skills necessarily in my pocket. I have to do a lot of reading, and luckily things like ChatGPT are helping me learn coding and learn topics a lot faster. I don't rely on them necessarily to teach me everything, but it really does help speed that process along. But I'll also harken back to the fact that like data visualization isn't necessarily always about numbers. I've worked recently on a conceptual model that nevertheless was describing how information is related to one another to help some folks understand the ecological and social factors that might affect the likelihood of jaguars recolonizing the American Southwest, helping me, distill out information using color and some text and also some, traditional axes that helped speed decision making on their part of where to focus their research priorities, for example, on things that maybe you don't have as much information about and are really important to address if you really want to support jaguar recolonizing the American Southwest. So those are just some examples that of the data visualizations that I kind of produce on a day-to-day basis. I really do love this planet, and I love and am driven by my curiosity about the natural world around me. And I feel like with the amount of data that's available out there, there's endless amounts of ways to visualize it and tell different stories. And really, it's my job in my line of work to figure out what those stories are and also to like deliver them in a way that's clear, concise, but also is nice to look at. And so that's something I think about very, very frequently. So I just want to like wrap up with a couple of takeaways from this talk and thinking about the trajectory of my career and thinking about the way that data visualization has played in that. I think that I just want to highlight, and as you go into this competition, visualizing and harnessing data on the natural world and our interactions with it is a key component of conservation storytelling. And it's more important now than it ever has been. Our natural resources are under assault, and I will be very frank in that. And I do see that data visualization and tracking those changes as things progress, as we get closer and closer to what we call ecological tipping points, we're really going to rely on things like data storytelling to really push the envelope and change people's hearts, change people's minds, and really drive them towards action to improve conservation and restore nature where we can. I'll note that skills in data analysis and thoughtful data visualization, which I will admit take a huge amount of practice. I'm constantly practicing. I'm not an expert necessarily in this, but it's something that I really enjoy learning about. They're really, really valuable if you want to pursue a career in conservation science. But I will note that they're really, really valuable in a variety of careers, and being able to condense data, tease out insights, and really present it in a clear and concise way, provided you have those skills and you're willing to work on them, you'll get really far. I will note that you have to get good at teaching yourself things and avail yourself of the many, many resources available. I'll note that I just put a link here. It's called Our Coding Club if you're really interested in like ecological data analysis, but more broadly, they have a variety of tutorials that are available that I used a lot in grad school and continue to refer to. It's a good way to get up to speed. This was all pre-ChatGPT. I'll note that we can think about using things like AI tools to help us with our coding, but really, I don't know that it's always the best. It's not a human. It doesn't have the creativity and ingenuity that the human brain does. And sometimes I think most of the time we have a better way of condensing and telling those stories in ways that I think are really compelling for other humans. Always be learning. There's always something new to learn. I peruse a variety of data visualizations, I see on LinkedIn, for example, on a daily basis. So I'm always trying to like keep that curiosity in mind. And I'll just note, here that data visualization doesn't always have to be about someone else's story. I talked a lot about telling the stories about the natural world, and how we need to communicate that to people that are making decisions. But I will also note that, just like I showed with that kind of crazy figure, that it can sometimes help you figure out your own story too. And so I'll encourage you all to think about, distilling all the information that sometimes gets clogged up in our brain, drawing some axes on a piece of paper, plotting some things. That can always help you, get out of your head a little bit and make some decisions should you feel stuck. So I'll just close really briefly with a favorite David Attenborough quote, because how could I not if I'm talking about ecology and conservation? And as you all embark on this next 28 hours of working with natural resource data, I really will note that it seems, so Sir David Attenborough says, it seems to me that the natural world is the greatest source of excitement, the greatest source of visual beauty, the greatest source of intellectual interest. It is the greatest source of so much in life that makes life worth living. And I really felt that as I was making this talk yesterday and thinking about the stories that we tell and how we can take that data and really pursue a world that is more sustainable, but more beautiful. And so I really hope that you all take that to heart as you pursue your data visualizations. And I'm very excited to see what you all come up with. So I'll close and say thank you so much again to Dr. Lee for the invitation, and thank you all for your attention. Should you want to get in touch, I'm always happy to do informational interviews. My email is here. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to take any questions. I don't think I can hear you.
Sorry, I had me on mute. Okay, so we have like 70 plus students here, and I was trying to use this camera I thought was fancy, but it keeps zooming in on people who are close by. Like you guys, you're like, I do not want to be on big screen. So you can't see the big audience here, but there is a good number of faces, and they're all smiling and was watching your presentation, really interested in what you had to say, and I hope it was inspirational for many of them. And it's really apropos of our topic and our theme this Plot-A-Thon year, which is conservation. We'll talk more about that, but I want to give some time to folks here, either in person or online, to ask Patrick any questions. And if you have a question, would you mind just standing up and coming up here? Because he won't be able to hear you if you're sitting in the back. So anyone have any questions, either here or online? Yeah, why don't you, can you come up? And please give him your name. Just introduce yourself very briefly, and then you can ask the question.
Hi, my name is Kala Pinsalang. I'm attending the Plot-A-Thon this year. But as you were talking about, especially your work right now with the conservation, it's more of a two-part question. Are you coming up with these like hypotheses of what's happening in the world and then going out to see if that data is there? Or are you getting this mass amount of data and trying to find the stories there? If it's the latter, how are you not getting like decision fatigue of what story to focus in on?
That's a brilliant question. Thank you so much for asking it. Part of the model of our organization is we do work with clients and partners. And so they often will come to us with a question or a hypothesis. And so they, we want to improve connectivity for game birds in Arkansas. And so helps narrow down a little bit. So I'm not like just constantly awash in data. I do have some direction. Nevertheless, I have to bring a lot. Our partners and stuff don't necessarily know how to use the data or really have a concept of what would be the most useful tool. And so that's where we have to innovate a little bit. So I will say that that's like a huge part of our job, and just the way that our organization is structured more as a consultancy, where we are contracted with organizations and partners who bring those questions to us. So we're actually really like decision driven, which is really nice. So it's not necessarily the same as being like an academic scientist, where I really have to, hypothesize about something and then figure out, like you're saying, like, does that data exist? There is a part of our job where we're encouraged to develop our own proposals and seek funding from organizations to do them. But I'd say that's like a smaller part of my job at this point in time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question.
Yeah, come up here, please.
Hello. I was just wondering, what would you say is the largest challenge for conservationists, and how, as a mathematician, can I contribute towards basically helping you overcome that challenge? And I'm going to stand up now because it's...
Yeah, that's okay. That's a great question. Whew. What is the greatest challenge, and how can a mathematician help? Whew. Political will, and so I don't know that how much from a mathematician perspective that necessarily can help. I'd say that political will to pursue conservation is our biggest challenge. In conservation science more broadly, statistics is at the heart of ecology. And I don't think I really fully understood that until grad school. It is a field that is built on trying to use statistical tools to extract meaning from our world. That's often extremely difficult because the data that comes out of the natural world does not obey many statistical principles of things like independence and like spatial independence and like all of these things. And so there's a huge amount of innovation from the mathematics and statistics world to develop methodologies that allow us to tackle those data challenges. And so I'd say that, finding a group to interact with that where you have ecologists and mathematicians in the same room, I think that's often where some secret sauce happens, where you actually do use the best of both worlds to try and tease out, new insights. So that's a really non-straightforward answer because I can't necessarily pinpoint a particular methodology that we really need to innovate on. But I would say that nevertheless, we need folks who are really good at math because I often have a lot of intuition about the natural world because I've studied it. I've been in the environment. I've been out and seen how species X interacts with species Y. But having somebody who has the ability to, take all of that and put it into a quantitative framework and then provide, we can work together on developing the tools that let us get to the answer that we want. That's where the collaboration happens. And so I really would say that conservation needs collaboration from folks like you.
Oh, wow. Sorry about that. No. Okay, sorry about that. I was trying to put a camera here and now it's like not letting me. Sorry about that. Yes, Kim. Sorry. All right. Any other questions? Is it still up? No? Oh, is there a question in the audience online? All right, come up, please. I'm gonna flip it around for a second here. Lots of good questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Awais. What's the thinking process behind getting the hypothesis from after seeing the whole data set?
Yeah, that's a great question. It all starts with exploratory data analysis. Often, depending on how you approach a project, I think that there are, you might have a particular area of interest where you are, you hypothesize that, animals will avoid areas where their predators are, for example. You can kind of start from that position from a theory-based position. Often in ecology, we kind of think about that. But in the work that I do, it's often leveraging these huge data sets that are available that aren't necessarily recorded with a project in mind. They're things like species occurrences that are recorded, on an ad hoc basis. To get to a hypothesis, I have to see what the data looks like, explore those relationships, plot things against one another, summarize them, and look at things like over time, for example, is always like a hugely important axis that I investigate if I have a temporal data set. Spatially, you want to see where things are clumped versus more dispersed, and so it's that process is really integral to the hypothesis generation and testing, where you're really looking at and exploring and pulling the data apart before you make a particular decision about what you're going to pursue further.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the question.
That seems like a really important point because through the data visualization, that's where you kind of see a little bit better or have a better understanding whether or not there's anything there, right? Right. So it's part of understanding. I actually had a question for you, Patrick. You've noted in your slide like the 3 tips, and the last one was kind of be open to kind of learning, like trying to problem solve and trying to seek things out, especially when you don't understand or don't have those skills yet. And I know this is what a lot of the students are going to be doing here at Plot-A-Thon, but I wondered, like, for you, what was the most challenging one that you had to kind of teach yourself?
Whew. That I had to teach myself. Great question. I would say from a data visualization perspective.
Yeah.
I think code-based geospatial analyses are not as straightforward as you think they are. And so I think that whole process was very challenging and sometimes continues to be challenging of like, how am I going to optimally display this information, which can often, when you think about scale, and as an ecologist, I'm always thinking about scale. Is it the local scale? Is it the national scale? And how do I display information at the national scale, but still tell the story I want? All of the things that go into that, like are, from code, statistics, all of those kinds of things, like geospatial analytics are not straightforward often. And so it's a continuous learning experience where, there will always be something new. I do not know everything. And that's why you really have to work as part of a team. Like not everybody's going to know everything, right? And sometimes you really need an expert in this, but they're not going to know anything about, crows or whatever it is that you're studying. And so you really do need that kind of team. And so I've had to rely on team members, mentors, other folks to help myself essentially, and try and build teams that can fill in each other's gaps. So overall, just to answer your question, geospatial analysis in general is always tough, but I'm halfway good at it now, which is nice. But it took a long time to get there. I'm in I started grad school in 2017 with no spatial analysis experience really. And it's 2025. And I use GIS and code-based GIS every day, and I'm still learning. And it's every time I open up R, it's a new challenge. And I love that part of things. It's something that really does actually make me happy.
Yeah, those of you who are working on R, have fun, right? No, everyone, I think it'll be great. I think whatever I do, I use Excel, and it's always fun when I'm learning new things. I feel like that is also perpetual for me. Any other questions, either online or in person? We're going to wrap this up, so this will be the last one. Yeah. Come on.
Okay, cool. Hi. So, I just wanted to ask, I don't know if you totally went over it already, but why elephants again?
That's a great question, and I love to end on that one. Honestly, they're the thing that speaks to me. I've loved them since I was a little kid, and it's just something innate. And they're the species. They're more than a favorite animal. I think I'm drawn to them for a variety of reasons. Their social complexity, their intelligence. They're huge. We live in a world with very few megafauna, large animals left. They're kind of like a relic of the Ice Age, essentially, of these large animals that I think I love it when the world can make humans feel small, because we have such a huge impact on the world in aggregate, but on the individual level, there are so many things that are really big out there and can squash us or make us feel small.
Yeah, that's
elephants.
That's
And they've been persecuted by humans for time immemorial, and we are at risk of losing them. And so that there's always been a part of me that's been wanting to be a champion for them. So probably a little bit more of an answer than you bargained for, but I'm just a nerd for elephants and always will love them.
No, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Yeah, I remember you, Patrick, talking about elephants back in the day when I was teaching the class. So it's fun to hear you still have that passion, and that you've been doing work with them. So anyway, thank you all for listening so carefully to Patrick's presentation, and the questions were fantastic, really, really engaged. And thank you, Patrick, for spending the time with us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Okay, you can't see it. Okay, thank you so much. And we're gonna move on to the next phase, but Patrick, can you show off your Plot-A-Thon t-shirt? Look.
Yeah, thank you for the swag, and thank you everybody for your attention. Good luck, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of that. So have a great afternoon, and good luck to all of you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right.